All right, here we go again. Living with Art, 11th edition by Mark Getlein. And I'm basically just reading through the book, chapter by chapter. And we are now on chapter 2. Art is something that has great value in our society. Across the country, art museums are as much a point of civic pride as new sports stadiums, pleasant shopping districts, public libraries, and well-maintained parks. From daring structures designed by famous architects to abandoned industrial buildings reclaimed as exhibition spaces, new museums are encouraged by city governments eager to revitalize neighborhoods and attract tourists. Inside our museums, art is made available in many ways, not only in the galleries themselves, but also in the shops that offer illustrated books, exhibition catalogs, and photographs of famous artworks reproduced on posters, calendars, coffee mugs, and other merchandise. The prestige of art is such that many of us visit museums because we feel it is something we ought to do, even if we're not exactly sure why. Many artists from the past have left moving accounts of just how much they too valued art. For Vincent van Gogh, to be an artist was a great and noble calling, even if the price to be paid for it the price to be paid for it in life was high. In a letter written to keep up his brother Theo's flagging spirits, he admitted that two of them were paying a hard price to be a link in the chain of artists in health, in youth, in liberty, none of which we enjoy. And yet, he continued, there is an art of the future, and it is going to be so lovely and so young that even if we give up our youth for it, we must gain in serenity by it. Here, as elsewhere, he speaks of art in a way that makes it seem greater than any single painting or sculpture, something that exists in an ideal realm. Van Gogh's world was not far removed from ours. He bought his paints and brushes at an art supply store just as we could. He walked out into the nearby countryside and set up his easel at the edge of a field just as we could. He painted wheat field and cypress trees, and here we feel the comparison ends. Van Gogh was an artistic genius. His vision of the world was so strong, so uniquely individual, that the force of it seems present in every brushstroke. The world itself bends to his intense way of seeing, its colors heightened, its forms undulating and alive, the golden grain, the writhing olive tree, the tumbling blue hills, the ecstatic cloud-filled sky. In another letter to his brother, Vincent sounds both prickly and confident. I cannot help it that my pictures do not sell, he writes. Nevertheless, the time will come when people will see that they are worth more than the price of the paint and my own living, very meager after all, that is put into them. After his death, that prediction came true. Even Van Gogh, however, could not have imagined that in 1990 one of his paintings would sell for $82.5 million. At that time, the highest price ever paid for a work of art. We are a long way from the cost of paint, lodgings, and food. Money, of course, is one way in which we express value. Part of the value today of a painting by Van Gogh lies in the fact that his work had a major influence on artists of the next generation, and so when we tell the story of Western art, he plays an important role. Part of the value also comes from the fact that there are a limited number of paintings from his hand, and there will be no more. But much of the value seems to lie elsewhere, in the connection that the painting allows us to feel with the artist himself, who has become a cultural hero for us, both of his accomplishments and for the story of his life. We value not only art, but also artists. We are interested in their lives. A handful of artists are so well known that even people who know nothing about art can recite their names. Van Gogh is one. Picasso, Michelangelo, and Rembrandt are others. In casual speech, we use them almost as brand names, saying, that's a Picasso, in the same way we might say, that's a BMW. Robert Watts created a work of art about this phenomenon in Rembrandt's signature, which is nothing more or less than the great painter's signature reproduced in neon as a work of art in its own right. Certain works of art, too, have become as famous generally as they are among art lovers. Van Gogh's own Starry Night is one of these. Another is the Aphrodite of Melos, popularly known as the Venus de Milo. But by far the most famous work of Western art in the world is the portrait known as Mona Lisa. Andy Warhol paid tribute to her renown in his slyly titled 30 Are Better Than One. Warhol painted the painting as a celebrity, someone whose instantly recognizable image circulates in endless multiples through our mass media. He depicted stars such as Marilyn Monroe and Elvis Presley in the same way, repeating their publicity photos again and again. Warhol was fascinated by how celebrities have a separate existence as images of themselves. But just as Marilyn Monroe and Elvis Presley were also private individuals with private lives, so of course the Mona Lisa is an actual painting with a physical existence and a history. It was painted by Leonardo da Vinci during the early years of the 16th century. The sitter was a woman named Lisa Gherardini del Giocondo. Leonardo portrays her seated on a balcony that overlooks a landscape of rock and water. Her left forearm rests on the arm of her chair. Her right hand settles gently over her left wrist. She turns her head to look at us with a hint of a smile. The portrait dazzled Leonardo's contemporaries, to whom it appeared almost miraculously lifelike. The Mona Lisa's current fame, however, is a product of our own modern era. The painting first went on view to the public in 1797, when it was placed in the newly created Louvre Museum in Paris. Writers and poets of the 19th century became mesmerized by what they took to be a mystery and mockery of the sitter's smile. They described her as a dangerous beauty, a fatal attraction, a mysterious sphinx, a vampire, and all manner of fanciful things. The public flocked to gaze. When the painting was stolen from the museum in 1911, people stood in line to see the empty space where it had been. When the painting was recovered 2 years later, its fame was greater than ever. Today, still in the Louvre, the Mona Lisa attracts millions of visitors every year. Crowds gather. People standing toward the back raise their cameras over their heads to get a photograph of the famous masterpiece in the distance. Those patient enough to make their way to the front find their view obscured by glare from the bulletproof glass box in which the priceless painting is encased. The layer of protective varnish covering the paint surface has cracked and yellowed with age. Cleaning techniques exist, but who would take the risk? Obviously, we do not see the Mona Lisa as Leonardo's contemporaries did, before the crowds, before the glass, and when its colors were fresh. Few people know, however, that scholars long suspected we do not see as much of it either. If you follow the balcony ledge out to the left and right edges of the painting, you will notice two small curved forms, the bases of two columns. Early copies of the painting include these columns, which frame the sitter. Based on the evidence of these presumably faithful copies, scholars assumed that at some point in the history of the Mona Lisa, at some point in its history, the Mona Lisa had been trimmed down, its columns cut away. Today, with our regard for art and for the genius of Leonardo, that seems unimaginable. Yet it was not so unusual for its time. Paintings might be trimmed down or enlarged, often to fit a favorite frame. Elaborate frames were luxury items as well, and highly prized. The ideas we have about art today have not always been in place. Like the fame of the Mona Lisa, they are a development of our modern era, the period that began little over 200 years ago. Even our use of the word art has a history. During the Middle Ages, the formative period of the European culture, art was used in roughly the same sense as craft. Both words had to do with skill in making something. Forging a sword, weaving a cloth, carving a cabinet, all of these were spoken as arts, for they involved specialized skills. Beginning around 1500, during the period known as the Renaissance, painting, sculpture, and architecture came to be thought of as more elevated forms of art, but it was not until the 18th century that the division became formalized. It was then, during the period we know as the Enlightenment, that philosophers grouped painting, sculpture, and architecture together with music and poetry as fine arts on the principle that they were similar kinds of activities that required not just skill but also genius and imagination, and whose results gave pleasure as opposed to being useful. As the 19th century began, the word fine tended to drop away, leaving only art, often capitalized to distinguish it from earlier uses and underscore its new prestige. Also during the Enlightenment, the philosophical field of aesthetics came into being and began to ask questions. What is the nature of art? Is there a correct way to appreciate art? Are there objectives, criteria for judging art? Can we apply our concept of art to other cultures? Can we apply it backward to earlier eras in our own culture? Many answers have been proposed, but the fact that philosophers still debate them should tell us that the questions are not easy. This chapter will not give any definitive answers. Rather, we will explore topics that touch on some common assumptions many of us have about art. We will look at where our ideas come from and compare them with ideas that were current earlier and elsewhere. Our goal is to arrive at an understanding of art as we find it today, in the first decades of the 21st century. Artist and audience. Claude Monet's Fisherman's Cottage on the Cliffs at Varengeville is the kind of painting that almost everyone finds easy to like. The colors are clear and bright. There is no difficult subject matter that needs explaining. We can imagine ourselves on vacation, taking a walk along the cliffs high over a beach below. We've stopped to appreciate the view near a quaint fisherman's cottage. How pretty the orange tile roof looks against the deep blue waters. Monet belonged to a group of painters we know as the Impressionists. Most of them met as art students in Paris, and they banded together because they shared certain ideas about what art could be. Like Van Gogh, his junior by 15 years, Monet spent his early adult life in poverty, painting pictures that few people wanted to buy. Unlike Van Gogh, however, he lived long enough to see his art triumph, eventually finding galleries willing to display his paintings to the public, critics able to write insightfully about them, and collectors eager to buy them. Museums accepted his work into their collections. When he died at age 86, his reputation as a great influential painter was secure. All along, he had been faithful to his personal artistic vision, working to express the quality of light on the landscape at different times of day, under various weather conditions, and across the seasons. Monet's world of art schools, galleries, critics, collectors, and museums is still with us, and artists still struggle to make their way in it. We may think of it as the way things have always been, but to the 15th century Italian artist Andrea del Verrocchio, it would have seemed strange indeed. One of the foremost artists of the early Renaissance, Verrocchio did not create what he wanted to, but what his clients asked him for. He did not work alone, but ran a workshop staffed with assistants and apprentices, a small business essentially that produced paintings, altarpieces, sculptures, banners, objects, and precious metals and architecture. He did not hope to have his art enshrined in museums, for there were no museums. Instead, displayed in public spaces, private residences, civic buildings, churches, and monasteries, the products of his workshop became part of the fabric of daily life in Florence, the town where he lived and worked. One of Verrocchio's best-known works is a statue of the biblical hero David. The work was commissioned by Piero de' Medici, the head of a wealthy and powerful Florentine family, for display in the Medici family palace. Piero's sons later sold it to the city of Florence, which had adopted the story of David and his victory over Goliath as an emblem of its own determination to stand up to larger powers. Thereafter, the statue was displayed in the city hall. Verrocchio had learned his skills, as all artists of the time did, by serving as apprentice in the workshop of a master, boys, the opportunity was available only to males, began their apprenticeship between the ages of 7 and 15. In exchange for their labor, they received room and board and sometimes a small salary. Menial tasks came first, together with drawing lessons. Gradually, apprentices learned such essential skills as preparing surfaces for painting and casting statues in bronze. Eventually, they were allowed to collaborate with the master on important commissions. When business was slow, they might make copies of the master's works for sale over the counter. Verrocchio trained many apprentices in his turn, including a gifted teenager named Leonardo da Vinci. The David may actually be a portrait of him. Our next three artists had yet another working arrangement. An audience, Desavanta, Madhava, Kurd, and Saravana were employed in the royal workshops of Akbar, a 16th century emperor of the Mughal dynasty in India. Their job, for which they were paid a monthly salary, was to produce lavishly illustrated books for the delight of the emperor and his court. Akbar ascended to the throne at the age of 13, and one of his first requests was for an illustrated copy of the Hamzanama, or Tales of Hamza. Hamza was an uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam. The stories of his colorful adventures were, and still are, beloved throughout the Islamic world. Illustrating the 360 tales of the Hamzanama occupied dozens of artists for almost 15 years. The painting here portrays the episode in which Badi-uz-Zaman fights Iraq to a draw. Prince Badi-uz-Zaman, in orange, is one of Hansa's sons, and Araj, in green, is a warrior who fights him just to see if he is as brave as he is reputed to be. Looming up in the background is Landhor, a friend of Hamza's. He is portrayed as a giant on a giant elephant, perhaps because of his role as an important presence behind the scenes. A single artist would sometimes be responsible for an entire illustration, but more often the paintings were the result of collaboration, with each artist contributing what he did best. Here, Desavanta created the overall design and painted the lavender rock formation with its billowing miniature mountain. Madhava Kurd was called on to paint Landhor and his elephant, while Sharavana was responsible for the rest of the figures. Like Verrocchio, these artists would have learned their skills as apprentices. Our fourth and final artist takes us out of the realm of professional training, career paths, and intended audiences altogether. James Hampton had no particular training in art, and the only audience he ever sought during his lifetime was himself. Hampton worked for most of his adult life as a janitor for the federal government in Washington, D.C. But for many years he labored secretly on an extraordinary work called Throne of the Third Heaven of the Nations, Millennium General Assembly. Discovered after his death in a garage that he had rented, the work represents Hampton's vision of the preparation for the second coming as described in the biblical book of Revelation. Humble objects and cast-off furniture are here transformed by silver and gold foil to create a dazzling setting ready to receive those who will sit in judgment at the end of the world. We do not know whether Hampton considered himself an artist or whether he intended his work to be seen as art. He may have thought only about realizing a spiritual vision. The people who opened Hampton's garage after his death might easily have discarded Throne of the Third Heaven of the Nation's Millennium General Assembly as a curiosity. However, they recognized it as art, and today it is in a museum collection and on view to the public. Our modern ideas about art carry with them ideas about the person who makes it, the art, and the people it is for, the audience. We take it for granted that the artist's task is to pursue his or her own vision of art, to express his or her own ideas, insights, and feelings, and to create as inner necessity dictates. We believe these things so strongly that we recognize people such as James Hampton as artists and accept a broad range of creations as art. We assume that art is for anyone who takes an interest in it, and through museums, galleries, books, magazines, and academic courses, we make it available to a wide public. Other times and places did not necessarily share these ideas, and most visual creators across history have worked under very different assumptions about the nature of their task, the purpose it served, and the audience it was for. Art and beauty. Beauty is deeply linked to our thinking about art. Aesthetics, the branch of philosophy that studies art, also studies the nature of beauty. Many of us assume that a work of art should be beautiful, and even that art's entire purpose is to be beautiful. Why should we think that way? And is what we think true? During the 18th century, our category of art came into being. Beauty and art were discussed together because both were felt to provide pleasure. When philosophers asked themselves what the character of this pleasure was and how it was perceived, their answer was that it was an intellectual pleasure, and that we perceived it through a special kind of attention called disinterested contemplation. By disinterested, they mean that we set aside any personal, practical stake we might have in what we are looking at. For example, if we are examining a peach to see whether it is ripe enough to eat, we are contemplating it with direct personal interest. If we step back to admire its color, its texture, its roundness, with no thought of eating it, then we are contemplating it disinterestedly. If we take pleasure in what we see, we say the peach is beautiful. Edward Weston's photograph, Cabbage Leaf, embodies this form of cool, distant attention, gazing at the way the light caresses the gracefully arcing leaf. We can almost feel our vision detaching itself from practical concerns. Good for coleslaw? Or is it too wilted? As we look, we become conscious of the curved object as a pure form, and not a thing called cabbage leaf at all. It looks perhaps like a wave crashing on the shore, or a ball gown trailing across a lawn. Letting our imagination play in this way was part of the pleasure that philosophers have described. But it's pleasure that we always feel in looking at art. For painting such as Giovanni's Pieta, sadness might be a more appropriate word. Italian for pity, Pieta is the name for a standard subject in Christian art, that of Mary, the mother of Jesus, holding her son after he was taken down from the cross on which he suffered death. Bellini intended the work as a devotional image, which is an image meant to focus and inspire religious meditation. Although the subject matter is both sad and moving as opposed to pleasurable, many people may still find the painting to be beautiful. Some theories link beauty to formal qualities such as symmetry, simple geometrical shapes, and pure colors. Here, for example, Bellini has arranged Mary's robes so that they form a symmetrical triangular shape. The white of Christ's loincloth is continued in Mary's head covering. The curve of the head covering is echoed by the curves of the roads in the background. The pure blue and violet of her robes are echoed by the paler blue of the sky, and matched by the intense green of the vegetation behind her, while the rest of the painting is in subdued but glowing earth colors. If we find Bellini's Pieta beautiful, perhaps those are the qualities we are reacting to. To contemplate the formal beauty of Bellini's painting, we detached ourselves from the pitiable subject matter in somewhat the same way that Edward Weston detached himself from many feelings he might have had about cabbages to create his photograph. But not all art makes this sort of detachment so easy. An image such as Francisco de Goya's Saturn devouring one of his children seems to shut down any possibility for aesthetic distance. It grabs us by the throat and shows us a vision of pure horror. A Spanish painter working during the decade around the turn of the 19th century Goya lived through tumultuous times and witnessed terrible acts of cruelty, stupidity, warfare, and slaughter. As an official painter to the Spanish court, he painted light-hearted scenes, tranquil landscapes, and dignified portraits, as asked. In works he created for his own reasons, he expressed his increasingly pessimistic view of human nature. Saturn devouring one of his children is one of a series of nightmarish images that Goya painted on the walls of his own house. By their compelling visual power and urgent message, we recognize them as extraordinary art, but we must admit that they leave notions of pleasure and beauty far behind. Art can indeed produce pleasure. As the first philosophers of aesthetics noted, but it can also inspire sadness, horror, pity, awe, and a full range of other emotions. The common thread is that in each case we find the experience of looking to be valuable for its own sake. Art makes looking worthwhile. Similarly, art can be beautiful, but not all art tries to be beautiful, and beauty is not a requirement for art. Beauty remains a mysterious concept, something that everyone senses, many disagree about, and no one has yet defined. Artists are as fascinated by beauty as any of us, and return to it again and again, though not always in the form we expect. Often they seek out beauty in new places, in a cabbage leaf, for example. Art and appearances. The son of a painter who taught drawing, Pablo Picasso showed talent as a child and was surrounded by people who knew how to nurture it. Like a Renaissance apprentice, he grew up so immersed in art that he mastered traditional techniques while still a teenager. He completed First Communion in 1896 at the age of 15, the year he was accepted into art school. After graduation, Picasso moved from Barcelona to Paris, the center of new directions in art. There he experimented with style after style. The one that launched him on his mature path would become known as Cubism, and it began to take form in paintings such as Seated Woman Holding a Fan. Picasso was part of a courageous generation of artists who opened up new territory for Western art to explore. These artists had been trained in traditional skills, and yet they set off on paths where those skills were not required. Many people wish they hadn't. Many people feel that art should aim at representing appearances as faithful as possible. That artists who do not do this are not good artists, and that paintings such as Seated Woman Holding a Fan are not good art, or perhaps not even art at all. Where do we get these ideas? The simple answer is that we get them from our own artistic heritage. For hundreds of years, Western art was distinguished among artist traditions of the world by precisely the concerns that Picasso and others turned their backs on. The elevation of painting and sculpture to higher status during the Renaissance had gone hand in hand with the discovery of new methods for making optically convincing representations. From that time until almost the end of the 19th century, a period of about 500 years, techniques for representing the observable world of light and shadow and color and space, the techniques evident in First Communion, formed the foundations upon which Western art was built. Why did art change all of a sudden? There are many reasons, but Picasso, when asked, pointed to one in particular: photography. Why should the artist persist in treating subjects that can be established so clearly with the lens of a camera? He asked. Photography had been developed not long before the artists of Picasso's generation were born. They were the first generation to grow up taking it for granted. Photography is now so pervasive that we need to take a moment to realize how revolutionary that change was. From the Paleolithic cave paintings until about 160 years ago, images had to be made by hand. Suddenly, there was a mechanical way based on chemical reactions to light. For some artists, photography meant the end of painting, for manual skills were no longer needed to create a visual record. For Picasso, it meant liberation from a lifetime spent copying nature. Now we know at least everything that painting isn't, he said. If the essence of art was not visual fidelity, however, what was it? The adventure of the 20th century began. Representational and abstract art. Both paintings by Picasso refer Both paintings by Picasso refer clearly to the visible world, yet each has a different relationship to it. First Communion is representational. Picasso set out to represent, that is, to present again, the visible world in such a way that we recognize a likeness. The word representational covers a broad range of approaches. First Communion is very faithful to visual experience, recording how forms are revealed by light and shadow, how bodies reflect an inner structure of bone and muscle, how fabric drapes over bodies and objects, and how gravity makes weight felt. We call this approach naturalistic. Seated woman holding a fan is abstract. Picasso used the appearances of the world only as a starting point, much as a jazz musician begins with a standard tune. He selected certain aspects of what he saw, then simplified or exaggerated them to make his painting. In this instance, Picasso took his cue from the fan. The lower edge of the fan is a simple curve. Picasso used this curve idea to form the woman's brow, her nose, her breast, and the line of her dress as it swings up to her shoulder. The top part of the fan is an angle or a wedge. Picasso used the angle wedge idea almost everywhere else. The shadow below the fan, the woman's left hand, and the shadow it casts, the arm of the chair in gray space they cut out of the background, and so on. Like representation, abstraction embraces a broad range of approaches. Most of us would be able to decipher the subject of seated woman holding a fan without the help of the title, but the process of abstraction can continue much further until the starting point is no longer recognizable. In Woman with Packages, Louise Bourgeois abstracted the visual impact of a standing woman all the way to a slender vertical column topped by an egg-shaped element. Woman with Packages belongs to a series of sculptures that the artist called personages. A person is a fictional character, as in a novel or play. Like a writer, Bourgeois created a cast of characters in an imagined world. She often displayed her personages in pairs or groupings, implying a story for them. At the opposite end of the spectrum from Bourgeois' radically simplified forms are representational works so convincingly lifelike that we can be fooled for a moment into thinking they are real. The word for this extreme optical fidelity is trompe-l'oeil, French for fool the eye, and one of its modern masters was Dwayne Hansen. Hansen's sculptures portray ordinary people in ordinary activities, cleaning ladies and tourists, museum guards and house painters. Like a film director searching for an actor with just the right look for a role, Hansen looked around for the perfect person to play the type he had in mind. Once he had found his model, and we may imagine talked him or her into cooperating, he set the pose and made a mold directly from the model's body. Painted in lifelike skin tones and outfitted with hair, clothing, and props, the resulting sculptures can make us wonder how much distance we actually desire between art and life. By opening Western art up to a full range of relationships to the visible world, artists of the 20th century created a bridge of understanding to other artistic traditions. For example, sculptors working many centuries ago in the Yoruba kingdom of Ife in present-day Nigeria also employed both naturalistic and abstract styles. Naturalistic portrait sculptures in brass were created to commemorate the kingdom's rulers. Displayed on altars dedicated to royal ancestors, each head was accompanied by a smaller abstract version. The two heads relate to concepts that are still current in Yoruba thought today. The naturalistic head represents the outer physical reality that can be perceived by the senses, and the abstract head represents the inner spiritual reality that can be perceived only by the imagination. Similarly, Louise Bourgeois' Woman with Packages could be said to portray the inner essence of the subject, whereas Dwayne Hansen's House Painter is about how abstract concepts such as house painter are rooted in the particular details of an individual. Somewhere between naturalism and abstraction lies stylization. Stylized describes representational art that conforms to a preset style or set of conventions for depicting the world. The Chinese porcelain bowl illustrated in Figure 218, for example, is decorated with a depiction of a dragon flying through clouds in pursuit of a motif known as the flaming pearl. A band of clouds rings the rim of the bowl as well. The clouds are stylized, defined by lines that spiral inward like a snail shell or a scroll. The individual clouds near the dragon are each formed from a bouquet of 4 scrolls and 3 trailing elements that wave like silk scarves in the breeze. The band of clouds around the rim is made of symmetrical mushrooming scroll forms, linked by waves of trailing scrolls. Scrolling clouds were a convention in Chinese art for many centuries, appearing on embroidered robes, porcelain decoration, and paintings. They are especially associated with apparitions of divine beings, including dragons. If you look ahead to the Chinese Buddhist painting illustrated in Figure 1917, you will see at the upper left a depiction of paradise set on a bank of scrolling clouds. They were painted over 600 years before the clouds on the porcelain bowl, but they are stylized in the same way. Chinese culture was highly influential, and scrolling clouds were adopted by artists in Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. To the west, they were taken up by Persian artists, as in this illustration of the ascent of the Prophet Muhammad. Persian artists also adopted the Chinese convention of depicting radiating light as stylized flames. The single stylized flame that issues from the flaming pearl on the porcelain bowl, a writhing, branching form, is multiplied many times to indicate the light radiating from Muhammad, his miraculous mount, and the archangel Gabriel, who, according to tradition, guided him on his nighttime journey through the heavens. Non-representational art. Even as Picasso and others experimented with abstraction, seeing how far art could go without severing its ties to the visible world, other artists at the beginning of the 20th century came to believe that only by abandoning these ties could art progress and realize its true nature. Instead of imitating or interpreting appearances, they found meaning and expressive power in the elements of art itself, in line, shape, form, and color. They referred to their art variously as abstract, non-representational, or non-objective. In this book, we reserve the term abstract for works such as Picasso's Seated Woman Holding a Fan and Louise Bourgeois' Woman with Packages, which retain cues to their origins in the visible world. Art that does not represent or refer to the world outside of itself we call non-representational or non-objective. Russian-born French artist Sonia Delaunay was one of the pioneers of non-representational art. In paintings such as Electric Prisms, she realized symphonic compositions of pure color arranged in a loose geometry of arcs and grids. Although Electric Prisms contains no references to the visible world, it had its roots in visual experience. Out walking one evening in Paris in 1913, Delaunay and her husband were fascinated by the halos of light surrounding the bulbs of the electric street lamps that had just replaced gas lighting on the boulevard. She returned often to sketch this new kind of light and the effects it produced, and from her observations she composed Electric Prisms. Up to the present, painting had been nothing but photography and color. Delaney wrote, but the color was always used as a means of describing something. Abstract art is a beginning towards freeing the old pictorial formula, but the real new painting will begin when people understand that color has a life of its own. A century later, non-representational art is no longer a revolutionary idea, nor has it supplanted representational approaches as some of its early practitioners predicted. Instead, it has taken its place as one of the possibilities available to contemporary artists, who continue to find ways to enliven it. Tara Donovan, for example, makes large-scale installations from accumulations of ordinary objects. She has stacked transparent plastic buttons until they resemble groups of stalagmites, covered a ceiling with an undulating blanket of styrofoam cups, and stacked wooden toothpicks into a 3-foot tall cube. Here, her chosen material is mylar, scrolled and gathered into spheres, the spheres joined in a way that suggests the sculpture grew by itself and might grow still more as we watch. Style. Terms such as naturalistic and abstract categorize art by how it relates to the appearances of the visible world. A work of art, of course, has a place in the visible world itself. It has its own appearance, which is the result of the artist's efforts. A term that helps us categorize art by its own appearance is style. Style refers to a distinctive, recognizable ensemble of recurring characteristics. If a person we know always wears jeans and cowboy boots, we identify that person with a certain style of dress. If a family has furnished their living room entirely in antiques except for one very modern chair, we would recognize a mix of styles. But if they do this in every room of their house and in every house they live in, then we would say that mixing styles is their style, and we would call it eclectic, meaning drawing on many sources. In the visual arts and other areas of life, style is the result of a series of choices. In this case, choices an artist makes in creating a work of art. As we grow more familiar with a particular artist's work, we begin to see a recurring pattern. To these choices, characteristic subject matter or materials, distinctive ways of drawing or applying paint, preferences for certain colors or color combinations. For example, now that you have seen 3 paintings by Van Gogh, the self-portrait on page 11 and 2.1, you can see certain traits they have in common, such as heightened color, thickly applied paint, distinct brush strokes, distorted exaggerated forms, and flame-like or writhing passages. Each subsequent work by Van Gogh that you come across will fine-tune what you already know about his style, just as what you already know will provide a framework for considering each new work. One theory of art maintains that style is what distinguishes artists from other skillful makers. Not all people who set out to make art eventually develop an individual style, but all artists do. An enjoyable way to get a sense of the great range of individual styles is to compare works that treat similar subjects, as in these 3 depictions of a woman having her hair combed. The first is a woodcut by the 18th century Japanese artist Kitagawa Atamaro. The second, a drawing in pastel by 19th century French artist Edgar Degas. And the third, an oil painting by 20th century American artist Susan Rothenberg. Atamaro's women are slightly stylized. Atamaro's women are slightly stylized. They do not strike us as particular people drawn from life, but as types of women drawn from the imagination, the beauty in her hairdresser. Their robes, too, are stylized into a series of sinuous curves. Slender black lines describe the faces and features, the robe and their folds, even the individual strands of hair. We could take away the color altogether and the lines would still tell us everything we need to know. Color is applied evenly with no lighter or darker variations. This makes the robes seem flat, as though they were cut out of patterned paper. The background is blank and gives no hint of where the scene is set. Edgar Degas' work in naturalistic style. The woman seems like a particular person, probably a model who posed for him in his studio. Faint lines describe the contours of her body and the chair she sits on, but these lines do not have a life of their own. as in the Japanese work, colors, but these lines do not have a life of their own as in the Japanese work. Colors are applied in individual strokes that remain distinct even as they build up in layers. Variations in color depict light and shadow, showing us the roundness and weight of the woman's body and sculpting the deep folds of the ruffles on the upholstered chair. Not all forms are depicted with equal attention to detail. The woman's body is very finely observed, whereas the outer edges of the image are treated more freely. The background is suggested rather than really described, yet the scene is clearly set in an interior. The composition is quite daring, with the servant's body cropped suddenly at the upper torso. Susan Rothenberg's style is a unique combination of representational and non-representational traditions. She portrays not complete figures, but fragments, bits of representation that seem to surface like memories in a non-representational painting. Here, two arms detach themselves from the red. Their hands grasp a dark mass. We understand it as hair only when we notice the small ear to the right that indicates a human head. A hand at the lower right offers a ring to secure the ponytail. Each of these artists formed his or her style with a particular culture during a particular historical moment. Artists working in the same culture during the same time often have stylistic features in common, and in this way individual styles contribute to our perception of larger general styles. General styles fall into several categories. There are cultural styles, Aztec style in Mesoamerica, period or historical styles, Gothic style in Europe, and school styles, which are shared by a particular group of like-minded artists, Impressionist style. General styles provide a useful framework for organizing the history of art, and familiarity with them can help us situate art and artists that are new to us in a historical or cultural context, which often helps understanding. But it is important to remember that general styles are constructed after the fact, as scholars discern broad trends by comparing the work of numerous individual artists. Cultures, historical periods, and schools do not create art. Individuals create art, working with, and sometimes pushing against, the possibilities that their time and place hold out to them. Art and meaning. What is the artist trying to say? Is a question many people ask when looking at work of art, as though the artist were trying to tell us in images what he or she could have said more clearly in a few words. As we saw in Chapter 1, meaning in art is rarely so simple and straightforward. Rather than a definitive meaning that can be found once and for all, art inspires interpretations that are many and changeable. According to some theories of art, meaning is what distinguishes art from other kinds of skilled making. Art is always about something. One brief definition of art, in fact, is embodied meaning. Viewers who wonder what the artist is trying to say are thus right to expect their experiences of art to be meaningful, but they may misunderstand where meaning can be found or underestimate their own role in making it. Understanding art is a cultural skill, and like any cultural skill, must be learned. Key terms related to meaning are form and content, materials and techniques, iconography and context. We look at them in turn. Form and content. In thinking about art, philosophers have found it useful to distinguish two aspects, form and content. Form is the physical appearance of the work, everything the eye registers about it, such as colors, shapes, and internal organization. Content is what the work of art is about, its meaning. For representational and abstract works, content begins with the objects or events the work depicts, its subject matter. Two paintings by Henri Matisse allow us to explore the intimate relationship of form and content in art. The two begin with the same subject matter, a piano lesson. They are the same large size. They even depict the same young student, Matisse's son Pierre, and are set in the same place, the Matisse family home, with the piano placed in front of a window looking out onto a garden. Yet their form clearly differs, and thus their content diverges as well. Piano lesson is abstract. Matisse takes his cue from the metronome, the pyramidal form that sits on the piano. A metronome is a device that disciplines musicians as they practice by beating steady time. The wind-up type Matisse depicts has a slender wand that ticks as it sways back and forth like a windshield wiper. The boy is concentrating so hard that his face is disappearing into this ticking. He is concentrating so hard that almost everything around him is vanishing into grayness. Outdoors, the garden has been abstracted into a green wedge. Even nature obeys the metronome. On the piano, a candle burns low, suggesting that many hours have passed. In the background, a woman sits on a stool, her head turned toward the boy. She seems to be a teacher, and a severe one at that. Actually, she is a painting by Matisse hanging on the far wall. Nestled in the lower corner is another work by Matisse, a small bronze figure of a nude woman. The boy's muse and inspiration, perhaps, but also another work of art. Music lesson sets music in a social realm of family togetherness. Again, Pierre practices, but he is not alone. His sister stands over his shoulder, watching him play. His older brother sits in a chair reading, while out in the garden, his mother works on a piece of sewing. Instead of a metronome on the piano, there is an open violin case with a violin inside. Matisse played the violin, and this is his way of saying, "I'm here too." The painting in the background is once again just a painting. Its gold frame visible, and the bronze statue has moved outdoors into the garden where it reclines by a little pond. The austere abstraction of piano lesson has blossomed here into a relaxed representational style of luscious colors and curves. We could summarize the difference in content by saying that piano lesson is about the discipline of music, its solitary and intellectual side. Music lesson is about the pleasure of music, its social and sensuous side. Matisse has expressed each message through a different form. We in turn have interpreted the form to arrive at the content. Materials and techniques. Matisse's paintings are made of oil paint applied with brushes to canvas stretched over a wooden frame. Oil paint, brushes, and canvas had been standard materials of European painting for centuries, and Matisse took them for granted. They don't represent significant choices he made. Similarly, Rodin probably took white marble and the technique of carving for granted when he created The Kiss, one of his most famous works. White marble had long been a standard material for sculpture in Europe, and carving was the standard way to shape it. With Jane Antoni's gnaw, in contrast, what it is made of and how it was made are the first things that grab our attention. The artist has reached far outside traditional art materials and techniques, and her choices are fundamental to the work's content. Gnaw consists of a 600-pound cube of chocolate and a similar one of lard, each gnawed at by the artist herself. The chewed portions of lard were made into lipstick, and the chocolate was made into heart-shaped partitioned boxes for fancy gift chocolates. They are displayed in a nearby showcase as though in an upscale boutique. Chocolate has strong associations with love as both a token of affection and a substitute for it. Lard summons up obsessions with fat and self-image, which in turn are linked to culturally imposed ideals of female beauty, as is lipstick. Gnaw is about the gap between the prettified commercial world of romance and the private, more desperate cravings it both feeds and causes. The gnawed blocks of chocolate and lard resemble the base of Rodin's statue after the couple has gone, and perhaps that is part of the message as well. The kiss wants to convince us that love is beautiful and that we are beautiful when we are in love. Not always, Naw replies, and the romantic illusions that work, such as the kiss, inspire are part of the problem. Iconography. In talking about form and content in Matisse's piano lesson, we relied on something so basic you may not have even noticed it. In fact, it was our very first step. We recognized the subject matter. We know what a piano looks like and what lessons are. We expect to see a piano, a student, a teacher. Other objects depicted in the painting required some research to identify. Who was the first viewer to notice that the teacher in the background is actually another painting by Matisse? Today, that information is standard knowledge, and almost any description of piano lesson will include it. But at some point, it was newly discovered. One object depicted in piano lesson even carried a traditional meaning of its own, the candle burning low, which has a long history in Western art of symbolizing the passing of time. This kind of background information about subject matter is the domain of iconography. Iconography, literally describing images, involves identifying, describing, and interpreting subject matter in art. Iconography is an important activity of scholars who study art, and their work helps us to understand meanings that we might not be able to see for ourselves. For example, unless you are schooled in Japanese Buddhism, you would not recognize the subject matter of Amida Nayurai, an important work of Japanese art. The statue was created during the 11th century by sculptor Jacho for a temple called Byodo-in, where it so resides. Its intended audience, Buddhists who come to worship at the temple, understand the statue easily. The rest of us need some help. Our investigation begins with the most basic question of all. Who is Amida Nayori? Amida Nayori is a Buddha, a fully enlightened being. The historical Buddha was a spiritual leader who lived in India perhaps as early as the 6th century BCE. His insights into the human condition form the basis of the Buddhist religion. As Buddhism developed, it occurred to believers that if there had been one fully enlightened being, there must have been others. In Japan, where Buddhism quickly spread, the most popular Buddha has been Amida, the Buddha of the Western paradise. The iconography of the historical Buddha image was established early on and has remained constant through the centuries. Amida is portrayed following its conventions. A Buddha wears a monk's robe, a single length of cloth, and drapes over his left shoulder. His ears are elongated, for in his early life, before his spiritual awakening, he wore the customary heavy earrings of an Indian prince. The form resembling a bun on top of his head is a protuberance called Ushnisha. It symbolizes his enlightenment. Sculptors developed a repertoire of hand gestures for the Buddha image, and each gesture has its own meaning. Here, Amida's hands form the gesture of meditation and balance, which symbolizes the path toward enlightenment. He sits in the cross-legged position of meditation on a lotus throne. The lotus flower is a symbol of purity. Rising up behind Amida is his halo, radiant spiritual energy envisioned as a screen of stylized flames. The iconography of this statue is readily available to us because it forms part of a tradition that has continued unbroken since its first development almost 2,000 years ago. Often, however, traditions change and meanings are forgotten. We cannot always tell with certainty what images from the past portray or what they meant to their original viewer. Such is the case with one of the most famous images in Western art, Arnolfini Double Portrait by Jan van Eyck. Pointed with entrancing clarity and mesmerizing detail, the work portrays a man and a woman, their hands joined. He has taken off his shoes, which lie on the floor next to him. Hers can be seen on the floor in the background. Seemingly pregnant, she stands next to a bed draped in rich red fabric. Overhead is a chandelier with but one candle. On the floor between the couple stands an alert little dog. A mirror on the far wall reflects not only the couple, but also two men standing in the doorway to the room and looking in. Standing, that is, where we are standing as we look at the painting. Over the mirror, the painter's signature reads, "Jan van Eyck was here." By the time the painting ended up in the National Gallery in London in 1842, it had changed hands so many times that even the identity of the couple had been forgotten. Researchers working from old documents soon identified them as Giovanni di Arrigo Arnolfini, a rich merchant capitalist, and his wife, Giovanni Sanami, also from a socially prominent family. But what was the purpose of the painting? What exactly does it depict? One influential theory claims that the painting records a private marriage ceremony and served as a sort of marriage certificate. The men reflected in the mirror are none other than Jan van Eyck and a friend, who had served as witnesses. Moreover, almost every detail of the painting has a symbolic value related to the sacrament of marriage. The bride's seemingly pregnant state alludes to fertility, as does the red bed of the nuptial chamber. The single candle signifies the presence of God at the ceremony, and the dog is a symbol of marital fidelity and love. The couple have cast off their shoes as a sign that they stand on sacred ground. Another more recent theory claims that the painting does not depict a marriage but a ceremony of betrothal and engagement. It commemorates the allegiance of two prominent and well-off families. In this view, the details do not carry specific symbolism, although many of them serve to underscore the couple's affluence. Canopied beds, for example, were status symbols, and as such were commonly displayed in the principal room of the house. Candles were enormously expensive, and burning one at a time was common thrift. The shoes were of a style worn by the upper class, and were probably taken off routinely upon going indoors. The dog is simply a pet. Everyone had dogs. Still, more recent research questions the identity of the sitters and leads to further impossible interpretations. The man may not be Giovanni d'Arrigo Arnolfini, but rather his cousin Giovanni de Niccolo Arnolfini. The woman would presumably be Giovanni de Niccolo's second wife, his first wife having died before the painting was made. The painting portrays neither a marriage nor a betrothal, but is a straightforward portrait of a prosperous couple. A fourth theory points out that we have no direct evidence that Giovanni di Niccolo remarried, and maintains that the woman is indeed his first wife, Constanza Trenta. She may have died in childbirth, perhaps even as the painting was in progress. We are looking at a commemorative image. The man is alive, the woman is not. He turns his raised right hand toward her to bid her farewell. Her right hand slips from his left, for she is no longer of this world. All of these theories are supported by impressive research and reasoning. Some scholars believe one, some another. Viewers will continue to find their own meanings in the magical painting, but we may never know just what it signified for its original audience. Context. Art does not happen in a vacuum. Strong ties bind a work of art to the life of its creator, to the tradition it grows from and responds to the audience it was made for, and to the society in which it circulated. These circumstances form the context of art, the personal, social, cultural, and historical settings in which it was created, received, and interpreted. This chapter has already made use of the kind of insights that context can provide. Near the beginning, passages from the letters of Vincent van Gogh helped set his painting on the context of his life and thought. In the discussion of Picasso's seated woman holding a fan, the challenge posed by photography was mentioned to set the painting in the context of the development of European art. The type of context that especially concerns us here is the social context of art, including the physical setting in which art is experienced. Figure 232 portrays a work of African art as we might see it today in a museum, isolated against a dark background and dramatically lit. The gilded carving gleams like a rare and precious object. We can admire the harmony of the sculpture's gently rounded form in much the same way that we contemplated the light flowing over Edward Weston's cabbage leaf earlier in the chapter. Yet the sculpture was not made primarily to be looked at in this way. In fact, it was not made to be seen in a museum at all. Figure 233 shows similar sculptures in their original context as they were made to be seen and used by the Akan people of West Africa. The men in the photograph are officials known as linguists. Linguists served Akan rulers as translators, spokespersons, advisors, historians, and orators. Every local chief employs at least one linguist, and more powerful chiefs and kings may have been attended by many. As a symbol of office, a linguist carries a staff topped with a wooden sculpture covered in gold leaf. Each sculptural motif is associated with one or more proverbs, often about the nature of leadership or just the use of power. In the photograph here, for example, the staff at the far left, portraying two men seated at a table, calls forth the proverb, "Food is for its owner, not for the one who is hungry," meaning that the chieftaincy belongs to the man who has the right to it, not just to anyone who wants it. In an Akan community, the aesthetic attention that we directed at the sculpture would have been unique privilege of the artist who carved the work and the linguist who owned it. Other members of the community would have glimpsed the figure only during public occasions of state. More meaningful to them would have been the authority that the staff symbolizes, and the pageantry that contributed to a lavish visual display that reaffirms the social order of the Akan world. Museums are the principal setting our society offers for encounters with art, yet the vast majority of humankind's artistic heritage was not created with museums in mind. It was not made to be set aside from life in a special place, but rather to be a part of life, both the lives of individuals and the lives of its communities. Its meaning, like that of the Akan linguist staff, was united with its use. This is as true for Western art as it is for art of other cultures. Figure 234 shows Titian's Assumption in isolation, as we might expect to find it in a museum or an art book. Assumption names another standard subject of Christian art, that of Mary, the mother of Jesus, being accepted boldly into heaven at her death. A Titian has imagined Mary being borne upward amid a crowd of angels, her garments swirling about her into golden glory. Above, God appears to welcome her. Below, witnesses marvel at the miracle. Titian's masterpiece does not reside in a museum, however, or on the white pages of an art book. It towers up behind the main altar of the Church of the Frari in Venice, in the exact location the artist painted it for. Thomas Struth's photograph, Church of the Frari, Venice, captures something of the experience of seeing Titian's work in context. Now we understand that the painting is part of a richly worked, massive stone altarpiece with fluted columns, marble inlay, and gilded carving. A statue of Christ crowns the ensemble, flanked by two monks. We can see how the tall arch shape of the painting repeats the pointed arches of the church itself, and we can appreciate how the painting's bold composition projects clearly into the cavernous interior. But all these ways of looking are still ways of looking at art. At its unveiling in 1518, the painting was seen through the eyes of faith. We need to imagine the effect it produced when Christianity was the central cultural force of Venetian life. Citizens filling the church of Frari would have felt the truth of their beliefs through the splendor of the architecture, echoing with music, the pageantry of the rituals, and the glorious vision of the miracle made present through Titian's skill and imagination. In Struth's photograph, light falls on a small group of tourists who have paused to look at the famous painting. They have come to look at art as though the church were a museum, and yet for a moment they seem transfigured. The museum as we know it today, a building housing a collection of art and open to the public, developed in Europe during decades leading into the 19th century, the same decade that witnessed the social upheavals that inaugurated our modern era, including the American and French revolutions. Viewed as repositories of the past, newly created museums were filled with objects that used to belong to aristocracy or the church, or to vanished civilizations such as ancient Rome and Egypt. All those objects were removed from the context that originally gave them meaning. Placed in a museum, their new function was to be works of art. Whereas the first museums were concerned only with the art of the past, many museums now exhibit the work of living artists, along with galleries that display and usually sell art and a circuit of international exhibitions that survey current artistic trends. They are the principal context for the art of our time. Our artists work with these institutions and spaces in mind, and as viewers we expect to see their work in these settings. There is a long tradition of artists who have protested the separation of art from the fabric of everyday life. Often they make art that tries to reach outside this specialized context or to question it. We will look at some of their ideas next, but there is an equally long tradition of artists who have explored what could be done within such a context. One such artist is Tom Friedman, whose inventive, labor-intensive works defy categorization. Here we illustrate a cereal box he made by cutting 9 boxes into small squares and then piecing them back together as one. Elsewhere he has exhibited a pencil process through a sharpener into one continuous coil of shaving, and a life-size statue of himself made of sugar cubes. Friedman not only intends his art specifically for the quiet, empty, white spaces of contemporary galleries and museums, but even suggests that the things he makes are not quite art outside such spaces. I think that after I make it and it goes into the gallery, it's in its sort of original context within a body of work, he explains. If a collector buys an individual work from the exhibition, it becomes historical, more of an artifact as opposed to the same conveyor of meaning it was originally. Friedman's remarks underscore the importance of context to meaning, just as his work illustrates how modern context of galleries and museums open up new possibilities for what could be seen as art. Art and objects. During the 20th century, many artists began to feel that something important had been lost when art was separated from life and placed in a separate, privileged realm. Seen in the larger context of consumer culture, where shopping and window shopping are favorite leisure activities, were museums and galleries really so different from department stores and boutiques? Despite the talk of meaning and spiritual value, did the role of the artist in modern society come down in the end to making objects for display and sale? Sometimes a slight shift in perspective is all it takes to open up new ways of thinking. A painting, for example, is indeed an object, but it is also the result of a process, the activity of painting. In questioning the purpose of art and the role of the artist in the contemporary culture, Many artists began to shift their focus away from the products of art to its processes, considering how they might be meaningful in themselves. Looking beyond the West to other cultures often provided guidance and inspiration. The Navajo practice of sand painting, for example, is one of the most famous instances of an art where product and process cannot be separated. For the painting, its making and its unmaking are all equally important. Sand painting is part of a ceremony in which religious specialists known as a singer, Hateli, calls upon spirit powers to heal and bless someone who is ill. The ceremony begins as the singer chants a Navajo legend. At a certain point, he begins making the painting by sifting colored sand through his fingers onto the earthen floor. The photograph illustrated here depicts two Navajo men demonstrating the technique of sand painting for the public. Actually, sand painting is viewed as a sacred activity, and photography is not usually permitted. The painting acts as an altar, a zone of contact between earthly and spirit realms, and together with the chanting, it attracts the spirits, the holy people. When the painting is completed, the patient is instructed to sit at its center. The singer begins to touch first a portion of the painting. And then the patient, gradually transferring the powers of healing. When the ceremony is over, the painting is unmade, swept with a feather staff into a blanket, then carried outside and deposited safely so that it does not harm anyone with the sickness it has taken on. The Navajo Hateli is a shaman, a type of religious specialist common to many cultures. A shaman is a person who acts as a medium between the human and spirit worlds. A jade carving from the ancient Mesoamerica Olmec culture gives visual form to ideas about the power of shamans. Standing in a pose of meditation, the shaman holds up a small creature whose fierce, animated expression contrasts vividly with his own trance-like gaze. The creature's headband, cat-like eyes, snub nose, and large downturned mouth identify him as the infant man-jaguar, a supernatural being mingling animal and human traits. The navels of the creature and the shaman are aligned as on an axis linking the cosmic and earthly realms. In Olmec belief, the creature probably served as the shaman's contact in the supernatural world. The person who most directly adopted the idea of the artist as a kind of shaman and art as a tool of spiritual healing was Joseph Baez. In his 1965 work, How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare, he covered his head in honey and gold leaf and appeared in a gallery cradling a dead hare in his arms. Walking around the room, he spoke quietly and tenderly to the animal as he brought it close to the pictures on display. On the floor in the middle of the gallery was a withered fir tree that Baez stepped over from time to time, still cradling the hare. Baez's performance, he called them actions, did not result in an object at all. They were ritual-like events that, for those who chose to reflect on them, touched on issues of art, society, and nature. Baez believed that the artist's role in a materialistic society was to remind people of human and spiritual values. He also thought that artists should be concerned with how these values point to the need for social and political change. As with other developments in Western art during the 20th century, accepting the idea that art could embrace process and performance helped build bridges of understanding to other cultures. The Masquerades of Africa, for example, constitute one of the most varied and compelling world traditions of art and performance. Masquerades serve to make otherworld spirits physically present in the human community. The photograph here shows a procession of nature spirits entering a community of the Bois people of West Africa. Raffia costumes and carved painted masks completely disguise the performers' human identities, which are believed to be subsumed into the spirit identities of the masks. Masks are called upon during times when the cooperation of spirits and the natural forces they control is especially needed. For example, masks may appear at festivals surrounding the planting and harvesting of crops, or during the initiation of young people into adulthood, or at funerals when their help is needed to ensure that the spirit of the deceased leaves the human community and takes its place in the spirit world of ancestors. When Western scholars first became interested in African masks, they tended to discuss them formally as sculptures, for this was the standard Western category of art that masks most resembled. Today, our broader understanding of art encourages us to see masks as an element in a larger art form, the masquerade, which is based in performance. Viewers, too, have a process related to art, the process of experiencing and reflecting upon a work. Artists looking for new directions, though, thought about this process as well. They realized that being in a gallery or a museum is itself an experience, and they began to take this into account in various ways. One result was a new art form called installation, in which a space is presented as a work of art that can be entered, explored, and experienced and reflected upon. Kara Walker's installation, A Subtlety, was created for a space that was already intensely evocative on its own. The cavernous raw sugar warehouse of the Domino Sugar Refinery in Brooklyn, New York. At its height, the Domino factory had been the largest sugar refinery in the world. It was shuttered in 2004 after 148 years of continuous operation, all but one of its buildings slated for demolition. Sponsored by an arts organization, Walker's installation allowed the general public to enter the warehouse for the first and last time before it disappeared. The past was still present in the warehouse. The sweet and acrid odor of burnt sugar still hung in the air. Molasses still oozed from the blackened walls and puddled on the floor. A subtlety brought another aspect of sugar's past into the mix. Its historical reliance on slavery, the vast sugar plantations founded by European colonists in Brazil and the Caribbean were worked by African slaves. The most imposing element of Walker's installation was a monumental sphinx with distinctly African features and a kerchief tied around her head. Blindingly white, she seemed to be made of solid sugar. In fact, the sculpture was built from blocks of styrofoam, then coated with 30 tons of sugar. Scattered around the warehouse were her attendants, 15 life-size sculptures of African children carrying large blankets and lugging bunches of bananas. Some were made of caramel-colored sugar and gradually disintegrated over the course of the exhibition. Others, cast in resin and coated with molasses, remained mute witnesses to their companion's end. Walker brought art into a specialized space, evoking a connection between what took place there and larger social historical issues. Other artists have worked in the opposite direction, slapping works of art into the everyday visual world. In 1995, Felix Gonzalez Torres had a black and white photograph of a single bird in flight placed in 6 outdoor locations around New York City. Nothing told passerby that it was art. No words tried to explain it or take credit for it. The artist presented the image anonymously, hoping only that people might notice, might wonder, might bring their own meanings to this unexpected encounter. Gonzalez Torres took the photograph himself, but his art consisted in having it reprinted at billboard size, renting the billboard locations, and slipping the image into the clamor of signs, symbols, and advertisements that surround us. The collector who bought the work bought both the right and the responsibility to perpetuate this gesture, manifesting the work as often as desired on outdoor billboards. The collector, in essence, bought an idea, insisting the art could reside in an idea, was the most radical of 20th century artists, many moves away from making objects. During the 1960s, idea-based art became known as conceptual art, a very intimidating name for so gentle, generous, and hopeful a gesture as Gonzalez Torres' billboard of a bird in flight. The questions that artists of the 20th century posed about the nature of their task and the great formal variety of their responses to those questions served to map the territory of the word art. We now understand that art can manifest itself in many more ways than the 18th century philosophers who invented the category ever dreamed. A painting, a sculpture, a video, an installation, a website, a computer program, a concept, a performance, an action. All of these and more may be presented and understood as art. That is chapter 2. Only took an hour and 25 minutes. Now,